April 14, 1978. Brussels, Belgium. A Xerox 3100 copying machine jammed during the night shift at the European Economic Community headquarters on Rue de la Loi. The technician called to fix it, a 42-year-old Belgian named Henri Moreau, discovered something wedged behind the drum assembly that shouldn't have been there. A miniature camera, no larger than a cigarette lighter, with Soviet manufacturing stamps visible on its casing. Henri pulled it free, turned it over in his hands under the fluorescent light, and felt his stomach drop. He recognized the model from a technical bulletin he'd seen 2 years earlier during a routine security briefing. What he didn't know yet was that his discovery would unravel one of the most sophisticated espionage networks operating in Western Europe, cost him everything he had built over 2 decades, and ultimately force him to make a choice that no man should ever face, between his country and his family. But standing there in that empty office at 2:30 in the morning, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of toner, Henri Moreau simply stared at the camera and understood that his life had just changed forever. The machine kept running. The building stayed quiet. Outside, Brussels slept under a light rain, unaware that a single malfunction in a copying device had just exposed a secret that 3 intelligence agencies had spent millions trying to protect. Before we go deeper into what happened that night and why it mattered, tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, stories that show you how the Cold War actually worked in the shadows, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because these aren't just tales. They're warnings about how close we came to losing everything. The context matters because nothing about that night happened by accident, not really. By April 1978, the Cold War had entered what historians would later call its second détente phase, a period of cautious diplomatic engagement between East and West that masked an espionage war more intense than anything seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The strategic arms limitation talks were underway. Western European governments were expanding trade relationships with Soviet bloc nations. American companies were selling grain to Moscow. On the surface, things looked stable. Beneath it, intelligence services on both sides were running operations with a paranoia and sophistication that bordered on madness. The European Economic Community headquarters in Brussels had become a priority target for Soviet intelligence precisely because it appeared so mundane. This wasn't NATO. This wasn't military. It was bureaucrats arguing about butter tariffs and steel quotas. But the Soviets understood something that most Western politicians didn't want to admit. Economic policy was national security. Every trade agreement, every tariff negotiation, every internal memo about energy dependency or technological cooperation gave Moscow insight into Western vulnerabilities. The KGB's first chief directorate, specifically Directorate S, responsible for illegal operations abroad, had identified the EEC as what they called in internal documents a soft institutional target with strategic yield potential. Translation: easier to penetrate than military installations, but just as valuable. The operation to place surveillance equipment inside the EEC building had begun in 1974, part of a broader program the KGB called Operation Harvest, designed to collect economic intelligence from Western European institutions. The Soviets didn't need to recruit high-level officials. They needed access to copying machines, telephone systems, mail rooms, maintenance areas. They needed people who were invisible: janitors, security guards, technicians. People who worked night shifts and weekends when the important people weren't around. People who had access, but no status. People like Henri Moreau. Henri had never intended to become part of history. He was born in Charleroi in 1936, the son of a steelworker who died of lung disease when Henri was 12. His mother cleaned houses. He left school at 16 to apprentice as an electrical technician, learned his trade fixing radios and industrial equipment, married at 23, had 2 daughters, and built a small, stable life doing contract maintenance work for various Brussels businesses. By 1976, he'd secured a regular position servicing office equipment for the EEC, a job that paid well enough for a small house in Ixelles, music lessons for his daughters, and a 2-week vacation in Spain every summer. He wasn't political. He didn't follow international affairs beyond reading the headlines. When colleagues talked about the Cold War, Henri mostly stayed quiet. He had work to do. But the Soviets had been watching Henri for 2 years before they ever approached him. This is how it worked. KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy in Brussels maintained files on hundreds of civilians who had access to target institutions. They looked for patterns: debt, illness, divorce, gambling, drinking, anything that created vulnerability. Henri's file noted that his younger daughter, Christine, had been diagnosed with a rare form of juvenile arthritis in 1975. The treatments were expensive. Belgian health insurance covered some costs, but not all. Henri had taken out a loan. He was managing, but barely. The file also noted that Henri's wife, Marie, had a brother who still lived in East Germany, in Leipzig, a man she hadn't seen since the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. In March 1977, a man who introduced himself as Viktor Leonov approached Henri in a café near the EEC building. Viktor was actually Major Oleg Sharapov, a KGB officer assigned to the Brussels residency under commercial cover as a trade representative. He spoke French with a slight accent and told Henri he worked for a medical supply company interested in expanding into Western markets. They talked about Henri's daughter. Viktor mentioned a clinic in Leipzig that specialized in juvenile arthritis, experimental treatments not available in the West. He said he might be able to arrange something as a gesture of goodwill if Henri was interested. No obligation. Just a conversation between fathers. Henri said no. He thanked Viktor politely and left. But Viktor had planted the seed. A month later, Christine's condition worsened. The Belgian doctors were running out of options. Marie cried every night. Henri couldn't sleep. When Viktor appeared again, this time with specific information about the Leipzig clinic, Henri listened. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Viktor never mentioned espionage. He talked about humanitarian cooperation, about how political differences shouldn't prevent sick children from getting help. He showed Henri photographs of the Leipzig facility, testimonials from families, medical journals in German that Henri couldn't read, but that looked legitimate. He offered to arrange everything: travel, treatment, costs covered completely. All Henri needed to do was help them understand how Western companies were using new copying technologies purely for commercial research purposes. Nothing political, nothing dangerous, just occasional technical reports. Henri knew what he was being asked to do. He wasn't stupid, but he looked at his daughter, barely able to walk some mornings, and he made the calculation that desperate people make. He told himself it wasn't really espionage, just technical information, harmless. He told himself he could control it, that he'd do it once or twice and then stop. He told himself his daughter's life mattered more than abstract concepts about national security. He was wrong on every count, but in that moment, watching Christine struggle to climb stairs, the choice seemed clear. The initial requests were simple. Viktor wanted to know what types of copying machines the EEC used, their specifications, their locations. Henri provided hand-drawn maps. Then Viktor asked about security procedures, when guards made rounds, which areas were monitored. Henri told himself this was still just commercial research. Then came the request to install the camera. Viktor called it a diagnostic device to study how Western offices use document technology. He said it would only be in place for a few weeks. He offered an envelope with 20,000 Belgian francs, more than Henri made in 3 months. Christine was scheduled to travel to Leipzig the following month. Henri installed the camera in February 1978. It took him 15 minutes during a routine maintenance call. The device fit behind the drum assembly of the Xerox 3100 in a 4th-floor office used by trade negotiators. It was designed to photograph documents as they passed through the machine. No wires, no external power. Just a battery pack that would last 90 days and a memory module that stored images until retrieved. The technology was crude by later standards, but sophisticated for its time, developed by the KGB's Technical Operations Directorate specifically for operations like Harvest. For 6 weeks, the camera functioned perfectly. It photographed trade proposals, tariff schedules, internal memos about negotiations with Soviet bloc countries regarding steel imports and chemical exports. Moscow received copies of documents that gave them insight into Western bargaining positions worth millions in trade advantages. Henri collected his payments. Christine traveled to Leipzig with Marie and received treatment that showed modest improvement. Henri told himself he'd done the right thing. Then the machine jammed. A simple mechanical failure, the kind that happened constantly with 1970s copying technology. A paperclip had fallen into the feed mechanism. When Henri opened the machine to clear it, the camera, loosened by vibration over weeks of operation, fell out of its mounting bracket and lodged against the drum. Henri pulled it free without thinking, examined it under the light, and felt the world tilt. He stood there for a long time. The building was empty except for a security guard 3 floors below. Henri could have put the camera in his pocket. He could have taken it home and buried it in his garden. He could have returned it to Victor and quit. He could have done nothing, installed it again, walked away. These options cycled through his mind while the Xerox hummed and Brussels slept. Instead, Henri did something that would later be described in CIA after-action reports as unexplainable, given the subject's previous cooperation and apparent vulnerability to leverage. He walked to the nearest telephone, called the EEC Security Office emergency line, and reported what he'd found. Then he sat down in the hallway outside the office and waited. The security response took 20 minutes. 2 guards arrived, examined the camera, called their supervisor. The supervisor called Belgian State Security, the Sûreté de l'État. State Security called the Belgian Military Intelligence Service, the Service Général du Renseignement et de la Sécurité. They called the CIA's Brussels station. By 6 in the morning, the 4th floor of the EEC building was filled with men in suits, photographing the Xerox machine and asking Henri questions. Why had he called? He didn't have a good answer. What made him report it instead of hiding it? He couldn't explain. The interrogators, professionals trained to read deception, saw something in Henri that confused them. He wasn't trying to play innocent. He wasn't constructing a cover story. He was simply sitting there, looking exhausted, telling them the truth about everything. Yes, he'd installed the camera. Yes, he'd been recruited. Yes, he knew it was espionage. Yes, he'd done it for his daughter. Yes, he wanted to confess. The interrogation lasted 14 hours. Henri described every meeting with Victor, every payment, every instruction. He drew diagrams of other locations where he'd been asked to place devices, though he'd never actually done so beyond the single camera. He provided descriptions of 2 other KGB officers he'd met briefly. He explained the Leipzig clinic arrangement. He showed them documents related to Christine's treatment. He held nothing back. The interrogators, accustomed to either full denial or careful partial admissions, didn't know what to make of complete honesty. A CIA officer named Donald Pritchard, assigned to the Brussels station as a counterintelligence specialist, sat in on the later sessions. His report, declassified in 2009, noted that Henri Moreau exhibited no characteristics of trained intelligence operative or ideological motivation. Subject appeared to genuinely believe he could compartmentalize cooperation with hostile intelligence service. Subject's decision to report discovery appears to have been impulsive, driven by what he described as inability to continue living with knowledge of betrayal. Psychological evaluation suggests genuine remorse rather than tactical positioning. But remorse doesn't erase consequences. By April 15th, Belgian state security had arrested Victor Leonov. He claimed diplomatic immunity and was expelled within 48 hours. The KGB Brussels residency, recognizing the operation was blown, evacuated 2 other officers within the week. The CIA and Belgian intelligence launched a joint damage assessment to determine what Moscow had obtained. The answer was significant, but not catastrophic. Trade negotiation materials, mostly valuable for economic advantage, but not containing classified military or NATO information. The EEC implemented new security procedures. Copying machines in sensitive areas were inspected and modified. The incident was classified and kept from the press to avoid embarrassing the Belgian government. And Henri? He was released after 3 days of interrogation. Not arrested, but not cleared either. Belgian authorities determined he'd been coerced rather than ideologically motivated, a victim of exploitation rather than a willing traitor. They decided not to prosecute, partly because his cooperation had been complete, partly because putting him on trial would make the penetration public, partly because the case existed in a legal grey area. He'd committed espionage, but under duress, with immediate confession. The prosecutors didn't want the complication. But someone at the CIA saw opportunity. Pritchard's report went to Langley, to the Soviet East European Division, where analysts were constantly looking for leverage points against KGB operations. They saw Henri Moreau not as a closed case, but as a potential asset. He'd been inside a Soviet network. He'd met KGB officers. He knew their methods. He had a daughter who'd received treatment in East Germany, which meant he had a reason to travel there. Most importantly, he demonstrated something rare, the capacity for moral crisis that could be manipulated. Tell us in the comments what time you're watching this, and if you think Henri made the right choice. Hit that like button if you want to know what happened next, subscribe for more stories about the people who got caught between superpowers, and turn on notifications, because the second half of this story gets darker. The approach came in June 1978, 2 months after Henri reported the camera. He'd been back at work, though transferred to maintenance duties that didn't involve EEC buildings. His security clearance was revoked. He was being watched. He knew that much. Marie had stopped speaking to him beyond necessary household communication. Christine's treatment in Leipzig had been discontinued. The Belgian doctors had resumed care, but the experimental medications weren't available. Henri felt like he was living inside a prison of his own making, surrounded by free people but isolated completely. Donald Pritchard visited Henri at his home on a Saturday afternoon. He introduced himself properly this time, showed CIA credentials, and asked if they could talk. Marie took the children to her mother's house. Henri made coffee. They sat in the small kitchen while rain fell outside. Pritchard's pitch was simple and terrible. The CIA wanted Henri to resume contact with the KGB. Not as a double agent in the classic sense. Moscow would never trust him again after his confession. But as bait. As a walking uncertainty. The agency wanted Henri to let Victor, or whoever replaced Victor, know that he regretted confessing, that he'd been scared and panicked, that he wanted to make amends. The KGB might reject the approach. They might suspect a trap. But they might also be curious. They might want to know how much Henri had revealed, what damage had been done, whether he could still be useful. Any contact would give the CIA insight into how the Brussels residency was restructuring after the Harvest exposure. Henri asked what would happen if he refused. Pritchard said nothing officially. No threats, no prosecution. But unofficially, Belgian authorities would be informed that Henri had declined cooperation. His employment prospects would remain limited. His family would continue under periodic surveillance. Christine's medical expenses would remain burdensome. Life would be difficult. Henri asked what would happen if he agreed. Pritchard said the CIA would provide support. Financial help for Christine's treatment through a medical foundation that couldn't be traced to agency funding. Protection for his family if things went wrong. Relocation if necessary. But mainly, Pritchard said, Henri would be doing something meaningful. He'd be helping to counter the same intelligence service that had exploited his desperation. He'd be turning his mistake into something useful. Henri understood this was coercion dressed as opportunity. But he also understood he'd run out of choices the moment he installed that camera. He agreed to Pritchard's proposal with one condition. Marie could never know the details. Pritchard accepted. The operation, given the cryptonym Maple Autumn, began in July 1978. Henri sent a message to Victor through a classified advertisement in a Brussels newspaper, a contact protocol Victor had established during their original relationship. The message was simple: technical difficulties resolved, ready to resume professional consultation. It was deliberately vague, designed to prompt a response without committing to anything specific. 3 weeks passed. No response. Pritchard told Henri to be patient. KGB protocol required time for evaluation, consultation with Moscow Center, risk assessment. Another message was sent. Then, in late August, a different man approached Henri outside a hardware store in Schaerbeek. He introduced himself as Martin, spoke French without accent, and suggested they take a walk. Martin was younger than Victor, maybe 35, with the controlled demeanor of someone trained in operational security. He didn't make small talk. He asked Henri directly why he'd confessed. Henri used the script Pritchard had prepared: panic, fear of arrest, belief he could minimize damage by admitting only to the one camera. Martin asked what Belgian authorities knew. Henri said they knew about Victor but nothing else, that he'd been able to protect the broader network. Martin asked why Henri wanted to resume cooperation. Henri told the truth, or a version of it. He needed money. Christine needed treatment. He felt abandoned by everyone. Martin listened without expression. Then he told Henri to go home and wait. He'd be contacted or he wouldn't. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Pritchard reviewed Henri's account of the meeting and felt cautiously optimistic. Martin had engaged, which meant the KGB was at least considering the possibility. But Moscow Center was notoriously paranoid about provocation operations, especially involving assets who'd been compromised. The decision would take time. It took 4 months. In December 1978, Martin approached Henri again, this time in a crowded metro station during evening rush hour. He handed Henri an envelope and walked away without speaking. Inside was a train ticket to Luxembourg and a hotel reservation for January 4th, 1979. Nothing else. No instructions. No explanation. Henri showed Pritchard the envelope. They had 3 weeks to prepare. The CIA brought in a technical team to fit Henri with recording equipment so small it could be sewn into his clothing. They ran him through basic counter-surveillance training, taught him how to recognize if he was being followed, how to signal for emergency extraction. They prepared cover stories for Marie about why he was traveling for work. They discussed worst-case scenarios. Pritchard tried to be honest about the risks. If the KGB suspected Henri was under CIA control, they might detain him, interrogate him harshly, even kill him. Luxembourg was neutral ground, but neutrality meant nothing in espionage. People disappeared from neutral ground all the time. The Cold War was full of bodies that were never found, men who vanished during what should have been safe meetings in safe cities. Henri asked what would happen to his family if he didn't come back. Pritchard promised they'd be taken care of, relocated if necessary, protected. Henri didn't entirely believe him, but he got on the train anyway. Luxembourg City in January was gray and cold, the kind of damp European winter that settles into your bones. Henri checked into the Hotel Continental near the train station, a modest place with brown wallpaper and thin carpets. The reservation was for 2 nights. He was told to wait in his room. Someone would make contact. He sat on the bed and stared at the telephone, wondering if it would ring or if men would simply appear at his door. The recording device taped to his chest felt enormous, though Pritchard had assured him it was undetectable. Every sound in the hallway made his heart accelerate. The contact came at 9 in the evening. A knock. Henri opened the door to find Martin standing there with another man, older, maybe 50, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in climates harsher than Belgium. Martin introduced him as Dmitri. They entered the room without asking permission. Dmitri walked to the window and looked out at the street while Martin checked the bathroom and closet. Standard procedure. Henri stood near the bed and tried to appear calm. Dmitri spoke in accented but precise French. He told Henri to remove his jacket and shirt. Henri's stomach dropped. They were going to search him. The recording device would be found immediately. He'd be exposed as a CIA asset within seconds. Everything Pritchard had promised about protection would become irrelevant the moment Dimitri's hand touched the tape on Henri's chest. But Henri unbuttoned his shirt slowly, trying to think of something to say, some explanation that might save him. Martin stepped forward and ran his hands along Henri's torso, professional and impersonal, the way airport security would pat someone down years later. His fingers touched the edge of the tape. Stopped. Moved on. Henri realized with shock that Martin had felt the device and was ignoring it. This wasn't incompetence. This was a message. They knew. They'd known before Henri got on the train. This entire meeting was theater, a performance to see how Henri would react. Dimitri told Henri to dress. They sat down, Martin and Dimitri on the 2 chairs, Henri on the edge of the bed. Dimitri asked Henri to explain again why he'd confessed after discovering the camera. Henri repeated the story about panic and fear. Dimitri listened without interruption. Then he asked a different question. What had Henri told Belgian authorities about the Leipzig clinic arrangement? Henri said he'd mentioned it briefly, but provided no details. Dimitri asked if Christine was still receiving treatment. Henri said no. It had stopped after his confession. There was a long silence. Dimitri lit a cigarette, offered one to Henri, who declined. Martin remained motionless, watching Henri with the focus of someone evaluating a malfunctioning machine. Finally, Dimitri spoke again. He said Moscow had reviewed Henri's case carefully. They understood his situation. They believed his confession had been genuine panic rather than planned betrayal. They were willing to consider resuming a relationship, but circumstances had changed. Henri was now a known security risk. He couldn't operate in Belgium anymore. Any further cooperation would require different arrangements. Dimitri explained what they wanted. Henri would travel to East Germany, to Leipzig, where Christine could resume treatment at the clinic. The treatments would be provided free of charge, ongoing, as long as Henri cooperated with certain requests. These requests would not involve espionage in the traditional sense. Henri wouldn't be installing cameras or stealing documents. Instead, he would simply live in Leipzig, work at a medical equipment company they would arrange employment with, and occasionally share observations about Western technical standards and practices. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous. A quiet life in exchange for his daughter's health. Henri asked if his family would come with him. Dimitri said eventually, once arrangements were secure. But initially Henri would travel alone to establish residency and employment. If everything went well, Marie and the children could follow within 6 months. It was presented as an opportunity, a chance to start over away from the suspicion and surveillance Henri faced in Belgium. Dimitri made it sound almost reasonable. But Henri understood what was actually being offered. The KGB wanted him behind the Iron Curtain, where they had complete control, where the CIA couldn't reach him, where he could be monitored constantly. They were willing to provide real medical care for Christine because it cost them nothing and gave them leverage forever. Once Henri and his family were in Leipzig, they would never leave. East Germany didn't let people emigrate. The Berlin Wall existed precisely to keep people in. Henri would be trading his daughter's health for permanent imprisonment, and not just his imprisonment, but his entire family's. He told Dimitri he needed time to think. Dimitri said there was no time. The offer was immediate, or it was nothing. Moscow had already invested resources in evaluating Henri's case. They needed a decision now, tonight, in this hotel room. If Henri declined, they would walk away and never contact him again. Christine would remain sick. Henri would remain unemployed and watched. The choice was simple. Henri looked at Martin, still silent, still watching. He thought about the recording device pressed against his chest, capturing every word. He thought about Pritchard waiting somewhere in Luxembourg for a signal. He thought about Marie, who hadn't touched him in months, who looked at him with something close to hatred. He thought about Christine, 12 years old, who couldn't run anymore, who cried when her joints ached on cold mornings. He thought about his other daughter, Anne, who was 10 and healthy, and didn't understand why her father had become a stranger. Then Henri did something neither the KGB nor the CIA anticipated. He told Dmitri the truth. He said he was working with American intelligence. He said the recording device was transmitting their conversation. He said he'd been sent to Luxembourg as bait to identify KGB officers and methods. He said he was tired of lying, tired of being pulled between organizations that didn't care about him, tired of betraying everyone, including himself. He said Dmitri could leave immediately or stay and be arrested. He didn't care which. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the gray city. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Dmitri laughed, a short, harsh sound without humor. He said something in Russian to Martin. They both stood. Dmitri told Henry he'd just made the stupidest decision of his life. They walked to the door. Martin paused before leaving and said quietly in French that Henry should protect his family because Moscow had long reach and longer memory. Then they were gone. Henri stood alone in the hotel room and felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in over a year: relief. It didn't matter what happened next. He'd told the truth to everyone. No more performances, no more careful scripts. Whatever came now would at least be honest. Pritchard arrived within 30 minutes, along with 2 other CIA officers and a Luxembourg police liaison. They'd been monitoring from a room 2 floors above. The recording had captured everything. They'd tracked Dmitri and Martin leaving the hotel and followed them to a car registered to the Soviet commercial mission in Luxembourg, confirmation of their intelligence affiliation. The operation, from the CIA's perspective, had been a complete success. They'd identified 2 KGB officers, recorded their methods, and confirmed Moscow was attempting to relocate compromised assets to the Eastern Bloc for continued exploitation. But Pritchard also understood that Henri had just destroyed any remaining protection. By admitting he was working with the CIA, Henri had made himself a permanent enemy of Soviet intelligence. The KGB didn't forgive betrayal, especially double betrayal. They would circulate Henri's description throughout the Eastern Bloc. If he ever traveled to a Soviet-aligned country, he would be detained immediately. More concerning, the KGB had resources in the West, networks that could reach Belgium. Martin's warning about Henri's family wasn't empty rhetoric. People who crossed Soviet intelligence sometimes had accidents. Houses caught fire. Cars experienced brake failures. Wives and children disappeared during shopping trips. Pritchard explained this to Henri during the drive back to Brussels. He said the CIA would provide protection, real protection this time, but it required Henri and his family to relocate immediately. Not to America, that would be too obvious and take too long to arrange, but to another European country under assumed identities. Belgium was no longer safe. Henri asked where they would go. Pritchard said probably Canada, through a refugee program the agency maintained for exactly these situations. He promised Christine would have access to medical care equivalent to what she'd been receiving. Henri returned home at 3 in the morning. Marie was awake, waiting in the kitchen. She asked where he'd been. Henry sat down across from her and told her everything. Not the script Pritchard had approved, not a sanitized version. Everything. The recruitment, the camera, the confession. The CIA, Luxembourg, the choice he'd made in that hotel room, the danger they were now in, the need to leave Belgium immediately. Marie listened without interrupting. When Henri finished, she stood up, poured herself water, and stared out the kitchen window at their small garden. Then she said she wanted a divorce. She said she would take the children and go to her mother's house. She said Henri could do whatever the Americans told him to do, but he would do it alone. She said he'd destroyed their family trying to save it, and she would never forgive him. Henri tried to explain about the danger, about the KGB's reach, about Martin's warning. Marie said she didn't care. She said the danger was Henri, had always been Henri, would always be Henri. She said better to risk the Russians than continue living with a man who'd betrayed everyone who trusted him. She went upstairs. Henri heard her moving in the bedroom, packing. He sat in the kitchen, and watched dawn come through the windows. Pritchard arrived at 8 with 2 Belgian state security officers. They'd received intelligence, he said, that a Soviet action team had crossed into Belgium during the night. They needed to move Henri and his family to a safe house immediately. Marie refused. She said she was taking the children to her mother's house in Bruges, and if the Russians wanted to find her there, so be it. The Belgian officers tried to explain the risk. Marie told them to leave. One of the officers looked at Pritchard, who made a small gesture that meant, "Let it go." They took Henri to a safe house in Antwerp, an apartment above a pharmacy in a neighborhood of narrow streets and old buildings. He stayed there for 3 weeks while the CIA and Belgian intelligence assessed the threat level and prepared relocation documents. During that time, Henri was allowed 1 phone call to Marie. She wouldn't speak to him. Christine came to the phone briefly and asked when he was coming home. Henri told her he loved her and that everything would be okay. Lies that caught in his throat. The Soviet action team never materialized. Either the intelligence had been wrong or Moscow had decided Henri wasn't worth the risk of an operation on Western European soil. But the threat remained theoretical and permanent. Pritchard said the agency's position hadn't changed. Relocation was necessary. Without it, they couldn't guarantee Henri's safety or his family's. Henri asked what would happen if he refused relocation and just went home. Pritchard said the CIA would withdraw all support. Belgian authorities would be informed that Henri represented an ongoing security risk. He would be under surveillance indefinitely. Employment would be nearly impossible. His family would be questioned periodically about his activities. It would be a life, but barely. On February 14, 1979, Henri signed papers accepting relocation to Canada under a new identity. The program was called Greenwood, managed by a classified CIA office that specialized in protecting defectors and compromised assets. He would be given a new name, new documentation, a modest financial settlement, and assistance finding employment in Toronto. He would never be able to return to Belgium or contact anyone from his previous life. As far as Belgian records would show, Henri Moreau died in a car accident in March 1979. There would be a funeral with a closed casket. The story was necessary to protect his family from ongoing KGB interest. Henri asked one final time if Marie and the children could come with him. Pritchard said the offer remained open, but Marie had made her position clear. She wanted nothing to do with Henri or the CIA or anything connected to the disaster Henri had created. She'd filed divorce papers. She was moving forward with her life. The children would be told their father had died. It was better that way, Pritchard said. Cleaner, safer, less complicated. On March 8, 1979, Henri Moreau boarded a flight from Brussels to Toronto, carrying a Canadian passport with the name Robert Miller. He had 2 suitcases, $4,000 in cash, and an address for a contact in Toronto who would help him establish residency. He'd been given a cover story, divorced businessman starting over after a failed marriage and bankruptcy. He was instructed to avoid contact with other Belgian immigrants, to never speak French in public, to maintain the fiction completely. The flight took 8 hours. Henri sat in a middle seat between a businessman who worked on a laptop and a student who slept the entire way. He stared at the seat back in front of him and thought about Christine, who would grow up believing her father had died in a car accident, who would never know that he'd sacrificed everything trying to save her. He thought about Anne, who would barely remember him. He thought about Marie, who would tell people she was a widow and eventually maybe meet someone else. He thought about the camera behind the Xerox drum, the tiny device that had unraveled his entire existence. The student next to him woke as they began descent into Toronto. She asked if Henri was visiting or returning home. Henri said, returning home. She asked if he was glad to be back. Henri said yes, though he'd never seen Toronto before that moment, would spend the rest of his life in a city that meant nothing to him, would die eventually as Robert Miller, a name that wasn't his, in a country that wasn't his, having saved no one and lost everything. Toronto in March was colder than Belgium. The contact met Henri at the airport, a man named Phillips, who worked for a CIA-funded organization that officially didn't exist. Phillips drove Henri to an apartment in Scarborough, a one-bedroom unit in a building full of immigrants and people starting over. He explained how Canadian healthcare worked, how to open a bank account, where to find employment agencies. He gave Henri a phone number to call if he encountered problems. He said someone would check in monthly for the first year, then quarterly, then eventually the contact would stop. Henri would be on his own. The apartment had furniture but no personality. Beige walls, brown carpet, a view of a parking lot. Henri unpacked his 2 suitcases and sat on the bed. He picked up the telephone and almost called Marie, then remembered he couldn't, that Henri Moreau was dead, that Robert Miller had no wife or children or past. He put the phone down. Henri, now Robert, found work within 2 weeks at an electronics repair shop in Toronto's downtown. The owner was an older Italian man who didn't ask many questions and paid cash. Robert was good with his hands, good with machines. He fixed radios and televisions and small appliances. He worked 6 days a week. He lived alone. He spoke to almost no one beyond basic transactions. He learned that Christine's condition had stabilized with new treatments available in Belgium. He learned this from Phillips during one of the monthly check-ins, information the CIA had obtained through Belgian intelligence contacts. Christine would never be fully healthy, but she would have a relatively normal life. She was doing well in school. Marie had taken a job as a bookkeeper. They'd moved to a smaller apartment. Anne was learning piano. Everyone was moving forward. Robert asked if there was any way to send money anonymously to help with Christine's medical expenses. Phillips said it was too risky. Any unusual financial support would raise questions. Robert said he understood. Phillips asked if Robert was adjusting to Toronto. Robert said yes. Phillips said that was good. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. Over the following years, the check-ins became less frequent and eventually stopped. Robert Miller became a permanent fixture at the repair shop. The Italian owner retired and sold Robert the business in 1985. Robert ran it competently, made a modest living, saved money he had no one to spend it on. He rented the same apartment for 12 years. He had no friends. He dated occasionally but never seriously. Women sensed something hollow at his center, something missing that couldn't be filled. In 1987, Robert learned from a newspaper article that Viktor Leonov, the KGB officer who'd originally recruited Henri, had been killed in a car accident in Moscow. The article didn't mention Brussels or Belgium or the EEC. It was just a brief item about a trade ministry official who died in an unfortunate incident. Robert read it twice and felt nothing. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall had already come down 2 years earlier. The Cold War, the structure that had defined Robert's life and destroyed Henri's, simply ended. Countries that hadn't allowed their citizens to leave suddenly opened borders. Intelligence files were declassified. Secrets that had been worth killing for became historical footnotes. Robert watched it all on television in his apartment and wondered what it had been for. He was 55 years old. He'd been Robert Miller for 12 years. He'd been Henri Moreau for 42. The math didn't balance. He'd lost more than he'd kept. He thought about applying for permission to visit Belgium, now that the restrictions were theoretically lifted. But who would he visit? Marie had remarried in 1984. Christine was 25, engaged to be married, working as a teacher. Anne was 23, studying law. They'd grieved for Henri Moreau and moved on. Appearing now would only reopen wounds that had finally healed. In 1994, Robert received an unexpected visitor at the repair shop. A man in his 30s with an American accent who introduced himself as working for a research foundation studying Cold War intelligence operations. He asked if Robert would be willing to answer some questions about his experiences in Belgium during the late 1970s. He said the foundation was compiling oral histories, that everything would be confidential, that Robert's current identity would be protected. Robert asked who had given the foundation his name. The researcher said a former CIA officer who'd worked with Belgian intelligence, now retired. Robert asked if it was Pritchard. The researcher said he couldn't confirm that, but didn't deny it. Robert said he had nothing to say. The researcher left a business card anyway, said the offer remained open. For 2 weeks, Robert kept the card on his workbench. He looked at it while fixing circuit boards and replacing transistors. Finally, he called the number. The researcher returned with a tape recorder. They talked for 6 hours over 2 sessions. Robert told the entire story, from Victor's first approach to the Luxembourg hotel to the flight to Toronto. The researcher asked careful questions. Did Robert regret his choices? Robert said he regretted all of them. Did he think he'd done the right thing by confessing? Robert said there had been no right thing, only degrees of wrong. Did he think the Cold War had been worth the human cost? Robert said he had no idea what it had been worth, but he knew what it had cost him. The researcher thanked Robert and said the interview would be archived and might be declassified eventually, decades in the future, when everyone involved was dead. Robert asked what the point was. The researcher said history mattered, that understanding how intelligence services actually operated, how they exploited ordinary people, might prevent future mistakes. Robert said he doubted that. People repeated mistakes because they thought their situation was different. Everyone thought they could control it. Robert Miller died in 2003 at the age of 67 from pancreatic cancer. He died alone in a Toronto hospital. His estate, such as it was, went to a cancer research foundation. The repair shop was sold. The apartment was cleared out. Among his possessions was a single photograph, carefully hidden, of 2 young girls on a beach in Spain, dated summer 1975. No one knew who they were. In 2009, as part of a broader CIA declassification project, Operation Maple Autumn was released in heavily redacted form. The documents confirmed that a Belgian national code named Evergreen had been used in a 1979 provocation operation against KGB officers in Luxembourg. The operation had successfully identified Soviet intelligence personnel and methods. The asset had been relocated under protective protocols. The file noted that Evergreen had demonstrated unusual psychological profile characterized by compulsive honesty inconsistent with intelligence tradecraft, and that this characteristic had ultimately compromised operational effectiveness but generated valuable intelligence on Soviet recruitment and control procedures. Marie Moreau, remarried as Marie Dubois, died in 2011 in Bruges without ever knowing her first husband had lived for 24 years after his supposed death. Christine Moreau, now Christine Laurent, still teaches in Brussels and has 3 children. Anne Moreau became a prosecutor specializing in fraud cases and never married. Neither sister speaks about their father. When asked, they say he died in a car accident when they were children. It's what they believe, because it's what they were told. The Xerox 3100 that jammed in April 1978 was decommissioned in 1983 and disposed of according to standard security protocols. The camera found inside it was analyzed by Western intelligence and used to train counterintelligence personnel in recognizing Soviet technical surveillance devices. It's currently stored in a classified facility outside Washington, along with thousands of other artifacts from operations that changed individual lives, while barely registering in the broader sweep of history. The EEC building in Brussels is now part of the European Union's institutional infrastructure. The 4th-floor office, where Henri Moreau discovered the camera, is occupied by trade policy analysts working on regulations that affect millions of people across dozens of countries. None of them know what happened there 45 years ago. The building has been renovated multiple times. The old Xerox machines are long gone, replaced by digital systems and networks and technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1978. But the pattern persists. Intelligence services still look for vulnerable people in positions of access. They still exploit personal crises, medical emergencies, financial desperation, family connections. They still make promises about help and protection. They still leave those people broken when the operation concludes. The methods are more sophisticated now, the technology more advanced, but the fundamental transaction remains unchanged. Leverage against compliance, crisis converted to control, desperate people used until they're no longer useful. If there's anything to learn from Henri Moreau's story, it's that the Cold War wasn't only fought by professional spies in dramatic confrontations. It was fought by technicians and clerks and maintenance workers who made terrible choices under impossible pressure. It was fought by families torn apart not by ideology but by circumstance. It was fought by people who tried to do right and ended up doing wrong, who tried to save someone and ended up losing everyone, who thought they could manage the consequences and discovered too late that consequences don't negotiate. Henri Moreau installed a camera to save his daughter. The camera was discovered. He confessed to save himself. The confession made him valuable. His value made him dangerous. His danger made him homeless. He spent 12 years as Henri Moreau and 24 years as Robert Miller, and neither man was fully real. He lived 55 years, but only 42 of them were his own. The mathematics of that loss don't balance, and they were never meant to. If stories like this make you rethink what ordinary people sacrificed while superpowers played their games, consider subscribing. These aren't entertainment. They're warnings about what happens when systems treat people as assets rather than humans. The Cold War ended 30 years ago, but the machinery that destroyed Henri Moreau is still running, still processing vulnerable people into useful tools, still leaving wreckage in its wake. The human cost of intelligence work isn't measured in successful operations or prevented disasters. It's measured in Robert Miller's living alone in Toronto apartments, in Christine Moreau's who never knew their father survived, in Marie Moreau's who grieved for men who were forced to become ghosts. It's measured in all the small deaths that don't make headlines, the erasures that happen for reasons classified decades after they stop mattering. Henri Moreau's file, what remains of it, sits in an archive somewhere with thousands of others like it. The operation is over. The participants are dead or dying. The secrets have been declassified. None of it matters anymore, except to remind us that it happened, that it could happen again, that the distance between ordinary life and complete destruction is sometimes just a jammed copying machine and a choice made in panic at 2:30 in the morning.